The courtroom air was thick with a heavy silence, as if the very walls bore witness to the weight of years pressing down on the frail figure shuffling slowly toward the defendant's bench. Calvin Brooks moved with the hesitant pace of a man carrying invisible burdens far heavier than his weathered frame could bear. His wrists were bound loosely, a gentle restraint that seemed to mock the dignity he once commanded as a Marine staff sergeant. His head hung low, weighed not just by the physical exhaustion but by the accumulated disappointments, the unspoken loneliness of a man forgotten by the world he had once sworn to protect. The clerk's voice cut through the stillness, mechanical and cold. "State your name." Calvin's eyes lifted, dim but steady, eyes that had seen war's horrors and peace's betrayals. "Calvin Brooks, Staff Sergeant, United States Marine Corps." The words escaped in a quiet rasp, a ghost of pride in a life now defined by invisibility. It was a name that once commanded respect, now merely a string of syllables recorded in a file. As the prosecutor outlined the charges, loitering behind the Riverside diner, trespassing, repeated citations, it was clear this was not a man threatening anyone. No aggressive panhandling, no disturbances. Just a man seeking warmth on cold nights, near the faint hum of a heater vent. The prosecutor's tone was clinical, void of empathy, focused on the letter of the law rather than the spirit of justice. Calvin had asked for only a few extra minutes to finish a sandwich given to him by the diner's cook, an act of humanity that now seemed criminal in the eyes of the city. Judge Miranda Ellis listened with a tightening in her chest. The law's cold hand seemed poised to snatch away the very shelter Calvin needed, condemning him to the merciless streets. The no trespass order would push him from the only sanctuary he had, the church's hot meals, the nearby shelter, stripping away what little comfort remained in a life shadowed by hardship. When asked if he had legal representation, Calvin shook his head slowly. No one was there to fight for him. "My lawyer got pulled into another case," he said simply. "Would you like to speak for yourself?" the judge inquired. "No excuses, ma'am," he replied with a voice roughened by time and regret. "Just needed to stay warm." Those words hung in the air, fragile yet powerful, an unvarnished truth amidst the sterile courtroom drama. His story was not just about trespassing. It was about survival, about the quiet desperation of a man whose uniform had been replaced by threadbare clothes and whose medals now gathered dust in forgotten drawers. The courtroom held its breath, the faces of strangers watching a man who once fought for their freedom now fighting for a scrap of dignity. In that moment, Calvin was not just a defendant. He was the embodiment of forgotten promises, of a society that honors valor with medals but neglects the man behind the stories. The judge's gaze softened, shadowed by memories and a growing awareness that justice was not only about enforcing rules but about recognizing humanity. And so, the trial was not merely a legal proceeding. It was a reckoning, a confrontation between past valor and present neglect, between a man's sacrifice and society's indifference. Calvin Brooks sat quietly, a soldier without a battlefield, fighting the harshest war of all, the war to be seen, to be remembered, to be given a chance to live again. Judge Miranda Ellis sat behind her bench, her fingers lightly trembling as they brushed the edge of Calvin Brooks' case file. The courtroom buzzed quietly with the murmurs of those present, yet inside her mind, everything slowed to a suffocating stillness. The name, Calvin Brooks, echoed like a distant bell tolling from a past she had tried to lock away. Her breath caught, a sudden sharp intake that betrayed the calm professionalism she had cultivated over 2 decades on the bench. This was no ordinary defendant. This was the man who had saved her brother's life. Memories surged forward unbidden, flashes of Jason's youthful face, the fierce determination in his eyes as he rode home from Iraq, the anguish when news came of his death. And in that same desperate battlefield, a figure had emerged. Staff Sergeant Brooks, moving through the smoke and chaos, pulling the wounded to safety. The very man now standing before her, diminished, worn, carrying scars deeper than the eye could see. Her hands shook slightly, and she gripped the file tighter, as if anchoring herself to the present. The weight of duty pressed on her shoulders, yet beneath it lay a profound conflict. The law demanded impartiality, but the heart whispered of debts unpaid and honor tarnished by neglect. How could she reconcile the cold letter of the law with the warm pulse of gratitude swelling within her chest? Her gaze fell upon Calvin's bowed head, the stooped frame that had once borne the pride of the Marines. She saw not a criminal, but a man abandoned, a hero lost in the shadows of bureaucracy and indifference. The judge's mind raced. How many like him were out there, silent and unseen, caught in a system blind to their sacrifice? She reached for her glasses and removed them, a rare gesture revealing vulnerability. Her vision blurred, not from age, but from a sudden surge of emotion. The courtroom faded to the background, replaced by the vivid memory of a younger Jason, full of hope and life, speaking of the brave Marine who had refused to leave him behind. The realization struck like a thunderclap. This trial was no longer about trespassing or loitering. It was about restoring dignity, about honoring a promise made on foreign soil, that no Marine would ever be left behind, forgotten or forsaken. Judge Ellis inhaled deeply, steeling herself as the proceedings resumed. Yet beneath the formality, her resolve had shifted irrevocably. She would not allow this man's years of service to be erased by the cold machinery of justice. Instead, she silently vowed to be the voice for those who had none, to turn the tide in favor of compassion over condemnation. The courtroom awaited her ruling, but inside a quiet battle waged, between duty and empathy, between the past and the present. Miranda Ellis knew this moment would change everything, not just for Calvin Brooks, but for herself as well. The doors creaked open with an almost imperceptible sound, yet it sliced through the stillness of the courtroom like a blade. All eyes turned as a tall man in a sharply tailored navy suit stepped inside. His presence commanding, unhurried, and unmistakably intentional. In his hand, a leather briefcase swayed slightly with each step, not heavy with papers, but with purpose. He moved with the calm confidence of someone who knew exactly why he was here, and exactly who he was here for. "Your Honor," the man said, his voice smooth but firm, resonating with practiced authority. "Nathaniel Grant. I've just been retained to represent Mr. Calvin Brooks." The air tightened. Calvin, seated quietly in the defendant's chair, turned toward the man in confused disbelief. His brows furrowed beneath the deep lines carved by years of survival and silence. I can't afford." "You won't need to," Grant replied gently, leaning close. His voice lowered but still audible. "My firm is covering this. Pro bono." Judge Ellis narrowed her eyes, not in suspicion but in measured surprise. The court hadn't been notified of this change. She had read hundreds of last-minute defense motions, seen theatrics before, but something in Grant's tone and bearing told her this wasn't about strategy. This was something deeper. "A recent development," Grant added calmly, anticipating her objection. "May I request a 15-minute recess to confer with my client?" She paused, her gavel hovering in the air like the weight of judgment itself. Then, with a single nod, she brought it down. "Granted." Outside the view of the courtroom, in the still air of her chambers, Miranda Ellis sat alone, gripping the photo she had not touched in years. It showed Jason, young, proud, alive, standing beside her in his dress blues. She traced his smile with a trembling finger. Then her eyes fell to the letter he had written just days before his death. In it, the words stood out with painful clarity. "If not for Staff Sergeant Brooks, I'd have never made it out. None of us would have." Back in the courtroom, Nathaniel Grant rose after his private consultation with Calvin. His stance was now firmer, more deliberate. "We request dismissal," he began. "Mr. Brooks was not trespassing. He was surviving. We have several witnesses who can confirm that he had implied permission to remain near the diner. He posed no threat, committed no crime beyond the desperation of staying warm." The prosecutor moved to object, but Judge Ellis raised a hand. Slow, deliberate. "Mr. Brooks," she said, her voice steady but softer than before. "Your file lists Fallujah 2004. Is that accurate?" Calvin lifted his gaze, nodding slowly. "Yes, ma'am. Were you involved in an operation on April 19th, near the Western Sector? He hesitated, the weight of memory pressing visibly on him. We were ambushed, escorting a convoy. I pulled out a wounded lieutenant. Wouldn't leave him. He kept yelling at me to help others. Brave kid. Before anyone could respond, a silver-haired man in the gallery rose. His voice cracked as he pointed. That's him. That's Staff Sergeant Brooks. I was there. He saved 6 of us. A hush fell over the room. It wasn't the silence of disbelief, but the kind that precedes reverence. Judge Ellis's breath caught in her throat. Everything she had suspected, everything her heart had remembered, was now confirmed by a voice not from her past, but from Calvin's. The testimony of a comrade, spoken not in defense, but in honor. There were no theatrics, no dramatic exhibits or flashing headlines. Just truth, raw and untarnished, standing in the same room as justice. And for once, they looked one another in the eyes. The moment Judge Ellis spoke the words, Fallujah, April 19th, the courtroom seemed to dissolve for Calvin. The present slipped away like sand through the fingers of his mind, and all that remained was dust, heat, and the deafening roar of war. His back stiffened slightly, the way it used to when instinct took over. Before fear, before pain, before thought. His eyes didn't just remember. They relived. It was supposed to be a routine convoy escort, a straight path through the outskirts of the Western Sector. But nothing in Fallujah ever stayed routine. The radio had been crackling with partial warnings. Something about unusual silence in Sector 4. And then the explosion ripped through the front Humvee. An IED, hidden beneath a pile of rubble, detonation timed with clinical precision. Smoke choked the air in an instant, sand and shrapnel blinding them. Screams followed, some distant, some horrifyingly close. Calvin hadn't hesitated. He was already out of the vehicle, weapon drawn, voice bellowing commands no one could hear over the chaos. He moved like a force of nature, not out of courage but necessity. You didn't stop in the middle of a kill zone. You moved or you died. Somewhere behind the wreckage, he heard it, a cry clipped and strained. I'm hit, over here. He darted toward the sound, skidding behind a collapsed wall. There lay the lieutenant, blood soaking his left side, one leg bent at an unnatural angle. His name tag read Ellis. The young man was trying to lift himself, but the pain had rooted him to the ground. Go help the others, he gasped. Leave me. Not a chance, Calvin growled, already wrapping a field bandage around the wound with swift, practiced hands. You breathe, I carry. That's the deal. Gunfire erupted to their right, sharp, relentless. Calvin flinched but didn't stop. With a grunt, he hoisted the lieutenant over his shoulders in a fireman's carry, the extra weight pulling at muscles that screamed in protest. Step by step, he moved through the dust-choked inferno, bullets cracking past his ears. At one point he stumbled, nearly going down on one knee. But the voice in his head, the voice of every Marine he'd ever trained with, kept him moving, one more step, one more breath. When he reached the safe zone behind the Humvee, he laid the lieutenant down. Blood covered them both. You're good, kid, Calvin had muttered. Now you hold on. The kid hadn't even thanked him. He'd simply stared with a look Calvin never forgot, a mix of disbelief, pain, and something deeper, gratitude laced with awe. Later, when Calvin returned to help pull more of the wounded, someone told him the lieutenant had been medevaced. They never spoke again. The names of the fallen were read the next week. Calvin kept the list folded in his wallet for years. Now, standing in a courtroom, far removed from the gunfire and the sand, Calvin could feel the heat of that day like it still burned on his skin. He swallowed, his voice roughened not by age but by memory. I wouldn't leave him, he said softly. Not while I could still walk. No one spoke. The silence was sacred. And in that silence, Judge Ellis closed her eyes for a brief moment. Because that boy, that wounded lieutenant, he wasn't just a soldier. He was her brother. And the man before her, once a shadow on a police report, now stood fully revealed, not as a defendant, but as a hero she owed a lifetime to. When Judge Ellis returned to the bench, something in her posture had shifted. Her shoulders no longer carried the stiff weight of authority, but something more human, more vulnerable. The courtroom, too, had changed. The air was no longer thick with legalese and routine formalities. It was reverent, heavy with the kind of silence that only precedes something sacred. All eyes turned to her, yet hers found only one man, Calvin Brooks. He stood slowly, not out of pride but reflex, military discipline hardwired into aging bones. His coat, too big for his frame, still held the dignity of his service. The frailty of age had not dimmed the sharpness in his gaze. But there was confusion there now, a wary hesitation. He had faced bullets and fire, but he did not know how to face recognition. Judge Ellis took a breath before she spoke, and when she did, her voice was steadier than her hands. "Staff Sergeant Calvin Brooks," she began deliberately, each syllable carved with emotion. "This court recognizes the incident on April 19, 2004, in the western sector of Fallujah. We have verified your actions during that ambush. How you carried a wounded lieutenant through hostile fire, saving his life and the lives of 6 others." The room was silent, holding its breath. She continued, "That lieutenant was my brother, Jason Ellis. He wrote about you in his last letter home. He called you the kind of Marine he hoped to become." Calvin's lips parted, but no words came. His eyes, though, told 1,000 stories. Of war, of loss, of years spent in the shadows. He looked away for a moment, struggling with a tide of emotion that had long been buried beneath survival. Judge Ellis stepped down from the bench. She no longer looked like a judge. She looked like a sister, a daughter of grief, a woman finally able to say thank you. Behind her, the courtroom doors opened again. 3 Marines entered, stiff, composed, and dressed in full formal blues. A colonel led the way, flanked by a sergeant major and a young corporal carrying a polished wooden case. Every step they took echoed with gravity. "Staff Sergeant Brooks," the colonel announced, voice ringing clear. "Under directive of the Secretary of the Navy, and in recognition of extraordinary valor, your Silver Star is hereby upgraded to the Navy Cross." The corporal opened the case, revealing the medal, gleaming, untouched by time. The courtroom gasped. Calvin stood motionless, eyes locked on the insignia that so many died hoping to earn. He whispered, "There must be some mistake." "No mistake," the colonel said gently. "And long overdue." A voice from the back called out, firm and proud, "Attention on deck." In unison, the entire courtroom rose. Officers, civilians, lawyers, even the prosecutor. Every soul stood and saluted the man who had once stood between death and his brothers in arms. Calvin's breath caught in his throat. His knees wobbled slightly, but he stood tall. Because after all these years, someone remembered his name. Judge Ellis returned to the bench, her voice tight with tears as she struck the gavel. "All charges against Staff Sergeant Calvin Brooks are hereby dismissed. This court is adjourned." But the proceedings did not end with the sound of wood against wood. They ended when a VA representative stepped forward, tablet in hand. "Your disability rating has been updated. 100% service-connected. Back pay included. Housing, medical care. Effective immediately." Calvin blinked. "What does that mean?" "It means," said Attorney Nathaniel Grant, stepping to his side, "you're going home." A man who had once huddled by a diner's vent for warmth was now cloaked in something else. Dignity restored, truth reclaimed. The final act of the courtroom came not from the law, but from life itself. Jimmy, the cook who had fed him scraps without knowing who he was, stepped forward with tears glistening in his eyes. "My dad used to talk about the Marine who saved him. Told me that if I ever met Calvin Brooks, I owed him everything. I just didn't know. It was you." No more needed to be said. As the crowd began to break, Judge Ellis descended the steps again. She reached out, placing a trembling hand on Calvin's shoulder. My brother died believing no Marine gets left behind, she said softly. And today, we made sure of that. Calvin's eyes welled. He didn't say thank you. He didn't need to. He simply whispered, "Someone remembered my name." And in that moment, a piece of him, long broken and forgotten, quietly began to heal. Calvin didn't leave the courtroom right away. He lingered, still anchored in disbelief, as if moving too quickly might cause the entire moment to vanish like mist at dawn. The medal hung around his neck, cool and unfamiliar, like a borrowed memory from another man's life. For a while, he simply stood, surrounded by people whose eyes now looked at him with reverence, not suspicion. And yet, it was not their recognition that struck deepest. It was the weight of being seen, truly seen, after so many years of invisibility. Judge Ellis remained nearby, her robe now shed, revealing the quiet humanity of a woman whose life had long orbited the laws of justice but was now, for the first time in her career, deeply entangled in its soul. She approached Calvin again, but this time not as a figure of authority. Her voice softened to something nearly maternal, something sacred. "I wish he could have seen this," she whispered, her eyes glistening as they searched his. "He never stopped talking about you. Said you carried more than his body that day. You carried his hope." Calvin's lips trembled, his voice cracking like dry earth. I never forgot his face. Or his voice. The way he wouldn't let go. Even when he was bleeding out. He paused, swallowing hard. I carried it with me. Through every night alone. Through the hunger. Through the cold. That memory. It was the only thing that told me I hadn't lost everything. She stepped closer, placing her hand over his. You didn't lose everything. You gave everything. And now we're here to give some of it back. Those words struck something primal in him. Not just gratitude, but the unfamiliar sensation of deserving. For so long, Calvin had survived on scraps, not just of food, but of identity, of meaning. To be told he was owed something was a kind of healing he didn't know how to accept. And yet, standing before the sister of the man he had once saved, he understood. This is what it means to come home. Nathaniel, the lawyer who had fought for him when no one else would, rejoined the group with a quiet smile. You were never just a case to me, he said. You reminded me why I became a lawyer in the first place. Calvin looked at him, his voice barely a breath. I don't know how to say thank you. You just did, Nathaniel replied. But if you really want to repay me, let people help you now. You don't have to fight every war alone. Jimmy, the cook from the diner, had been standing off to the side, nervously wringing his hands. He approached with a cautious smile and a paper bag in his hand. Made you something hot, he said sheepishly. Not scraps this time. Real meal. I didn't know back then, but my dad, he was in that convoy. You saved him too. Calvin took the bag, and with it, a thread of connection that felt more powerful than any medal. He managed a weak smile. His first in what felt like decades. Smells like redemption. They laughed. Not politely, not formally, but from somewhere deep. Somewhere that hadn't felt laughter in a long time. Outside, the sky was beginning to soften into evening, gold bleeding into blue like a sigh. Calvin stepped through the courthouse doors with a new gait. Not faster, not stronger, but steadier. He wasn't just a man free from charges. He was a man reclaimed. As they walked together, Ellis, Nathaniel, Jimmy, Calvin looked up at the sky, blinking against the light. You ever think, he murmured, that maybe we don't really come back from war? We just wait for the world to come find us. Judge Ellis touched his shoulder. Well, she said, we found you. And we're not letting go. He didn't answer. He didn't need to. His silence was full of peace, of grief, of grace. And for the first time in 16 long bitter years, Calvin Brooks walked not away from something, but toward it. Toward warmth. Toward dignity. Toward healing. Toward home. In the weeks that followed, the world did not transform overnight, but something within Calvin Brooks began to shift. Quietly, tenderly, like snow melting on a frozen rooftop. His days no longer began with the shiver of waking on cold cement or the gnawing dread of being moved along by another uniformed voice. Instead, they started with morning light spilling through modest curtains in a room of his own, the steady hum of a heater at his feet, and the distant sound of city life carrying on beyond walls that finally belonged to him. The apartment was small but clean, tucked in a housing program designed for veterans like him, those who had once worn a uniform with pride and returned to a world that too often forgot them. But here, in this quiet space on the third floor of a worn red brick building, Calvin found something that eluded him for years: stillness without fear. The walls bore his story now. Framed medals once boxed away in dusty shame were mounted with care, their brass shining with a dignity long denied. Among them, the Navy Cross stood out, not for its gleam, but for what it represented. Not just valor in combat, but a world finally saying we remember. Nearby, a faded photograph of Lieutenant Jason Ellis smiled out at him from behind glass, a ghost-turned guardian, reminding him that sacrifice does not vanish. It echoes. Judge Miranda Ellis visited often. She no longer came in robes, no longer needed the authority of a bench to bridge the gap between them. She came as Miranda now, a woman carrying her brother's legacy not as a burden but as a promise fulfilled. Together they shared stories, sometimes laughter, sometimes silence. She brought more letters from Jason, each one a thread connecting past to present. And in return, Calvin brought her the truths he'd buried, slowly unpacking the years, not with bitterness, but with the tender ache of someone learning to trust again. Nathaniel, ever the quiet force behind the turning tide, continued to advocate, not just for Calvin but for others like him. He helped fast-track policies to protect homeless veterans in Northbridge, to fund shelters, to provide legal aid without judgment. Each victory, however small, was a stone laid on the path Calvin had unwittingly carved for others. And Jimmy, the diner cook, became something of a son to him. He checked in daily, always with food, always with warmth. One afternoon, he showed up with an envelope, his hands shaking. Inside was a photo of his father in uniform. "He always told me someone saved him," Jimmy whispered. "Now I know who. You're part of my family now, Calvin. Always." As the seasons turned, so did Calvin's heart. He began volunteering at the local shelter, not out of debt, but out of purpose. He listened to the broken, to the lost, to the ones who still huddled in shadows. He didn't speak often, but when he did, his voice carried a weight that drew silence, respect, and hope. "You matter," he would say, even when no one sees it yet. And then, one crisp evening, Calvin stood at a small podium at the Veterans Center. The room was full: neighbors, lawyers, Marines, even former prosecutors. Judge Ellis sat in the front row. He cleared his throat, fingers trembling only slightly. "I used to think being forgotten was the price we paid," he said softly. "But I was wrong. The real price is silence. Letting the story die inside you. Letting the darkness win. But someone remembered my name. And now, I remember who I am." He paused, eyes wet but clear. "We carry each other through fire, through grief, through time. That's what makes us more than soldiers. That's what makes us whole." The room stood in applause, not just for the speech, but for the man, for everything he was and everything he had come back from. Later that night, Calvin returned home, the streets quiet beneath a silver moon. He looked up at the sky, hands in his pockets, breath curling in the air. For the first time in years, he wasn't looking for answers. He was simply looking forward.